She whispered. He wore no face, just eyes. Then she collapsed and never spoke again. That's how it started. Not with a body, not with blood, but with a sentence scratched into the back of a gaslight post near Bucks Row, Whitechapel, August 1888, etched in something that looked like coal but flaked like ash when touched. The words were written backward, as if meant for a mirror, as if meant for someone watching. A week later, the first victim bled out into cobblestones worn thin by boots that had forgotten where they were going. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols. But she wasn't the first. And she wasn't the last. Not really. Because the killings didn't start in 1888. That's when they became useful. Let that sink in. This isn't about a serial killer. This isn't about London. This is about a machine, a system of silence. And a man, or something passing as one, whose knife was just the beginning. But before start this story, please like and subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to press this bell icon. The Ripper wasn't just killing, he was collecting patterns, blood types, reactions, because behind every gutted woman there was an institution watching. The Crown, the Lodge, and something even older, buried beneath the city in tunnels no map ever dared to draw. Historians want you to believe it was random, panic, madness, maybe even syphilis. But men with madness don't leave behind symbols, and every victim was marked, carved, blood led in a way that matched rituals kept hidden in royal archives. You want to know why the case was never solved? Because it was never meant to be. Every time a witness came forward, they vanished. Records rewritten, witnesses labeled mad. The fog wasn't just weather, it was policy. A rolling curtain of plausible deniability, thick enough to bury what you weren't supposed to see. But some things refused to stay hidden. Especially things born in blood. And you're not watching this by accident. You're here because something in you already knows the world isn't what it seems. Because maybe, just maybe, you've started to feel it too. That gnawing question when you're alone. That sense of being watched by something older than time. That whisper behind history books telling you there's more. And you're right. This is the story they tried to kill. And if you keep listening, you'll never see the world the same way again. There are nights in Whitechapel that still haven't ended, air thick with soot, and screams that echo through generations like unfinished sentences. The Ripper didn't just cut flesh, he rewrote time. Every slice, every mutilation was surgical in purpose. Arteries open not for sadism, but for data. London, in the late 1800s, wasn't a city. It was an open-air experiment. The East End, deliberately neglected, had been quarantined long before the first woman fell. Rats in the alleys, rotting wood along Dorset Street, children coughing up blood in slums. None of it was accident. The people were starved, watched, prodded, and then offered. Each murder site was mapped against occult geometry, matching ley lines traced back to ancient druidic sites buried beneath London's foundations. Scotland Yard knew. Certain inspectors, especially Aberline, were never meant to catch the killer. They were meant to chase shadows. When Catherine Eddowes was killed, her face mutilated into a mockery of human identity, there were 2 chalk circles found under her body, one around her heart, the other her womb, both aligned to full moon cycles. Why? Because wombs meant access to creation, and hearts to memory. The Ripper was trying to extract something older than life, and someone was paying him to do it. Every witness gave different descriptions of the killer: tall, short, mustached, clean-shaven. Some said his hands glowed, others said he vanished into smoke. What if they were all right? What if Jack wasn't a man at all, but a vessel? a changing mask worn by an order far deeper than the Freemasons, buried in parchment and bone beneath the crown itself. No motive, no signature, just design. And what about the letters? From hell, written in red, folded with half a kidney inside. Not meant to taunt, meant to feed, but not the press, not the public, meant for something else. The ritual hadn't ended, it had only just begun. Ask yourself, why do we still speak his name? Why does every generation resurrect him, imagine him, paint him, mythologize him? Because some symbols are not just remembered, they are summoned. And Jack was not a man. Jack was a door. What the public was never told, and what was buried under layers of redacted testimony and priest-sealed records, was that the 5 canonical victims weren't chosen randomly. They were selected. Every one of them, from Polly Nichols to Mary Jane Kelly, carried a thread that tied them not just to poverty or prostitution, but to ritual history. 4 of them had received care at the London hospital, specifically from one physician who curiously vanished just months after the last murder. And Mary Jane Kelly? She wasn't even her real name. Her birth name, long hidden, matched that of a girl listed in an abandoned orphanage ledger destroyed in a fire that was never investigated. That orphanage, located on Finch Lane, was run by a group known as the Order of St. Basil, a religious society that operated without oversight, funding missions abroad, and something far darker at home. Rumors spoke of dream experiments, stolen infants, and rituals conducted beneath the chapel floor. When Mary Jane was killed, skinned, eviscerated, and spread across her bed like a dissected offering, it wasn't an act of rage. It was ceremony. Her death occurred on the anniversary of a Roman rite meant to bind the living to the dead through blood sympathy. She wasn't the final victim. She was the conclusion. A ceiling of something opened in the first. Those 5 women, when aligned on a map, form a perfect inverted pentagram, each point corresponding with ancient burial sites older than the city itself. This isn't conspiracy. This is cartography. And when that alignment was complete, the murders stopped not because Jack was caught, but because the door was closed. For now, because here's what they won't tell you. Similar murders occurred a decade later, in Chicago, then again in New Orleans, then in Melbourne, all with the same precision, same organ removal, same deliberate display. As if the Ripper's hand could stretch across oceans, or as if something had been unleashed, passed from vessel to vessel like a blood-soaked inheritance. Do you still think this was just a man with a knife? Or are you starting to feel it, the weight of the pattern, because once you do, you never walk alone again? They called her Annie Chapman, but she carried 6 names before that. Each one belonged to a woman who had vanished from institutional care, first a sanitarium in Kent, then a Magdalen laundry in Liverpool, then an asylum in East Sussex that had quietly changed names after a patient uprising. Annie was not insane. She was recovered from somewhere they never named. When she was found in the early hours of September 8th, her womb had been taken with such speed and precision that even the attending coroner admitted he'd seen nothing like it. Not in combat, not in medical theater, not even in surgical training. Her throat wasn't just slit, it was opened, like a gate. What they left out of the final report was the smell, not of decay, but of salt and iron and roses. Witnesses that morning claimed the scent lingered for hours, carried in a spiral on the wind, despite no flowers present and no open wounds remaining. And that's when the stories began, the real ones. One man claimed he saw Annie walking 3 nights after her death, barefoot and smiling, carrying a single white feather. A constable confessed under pressure that he found her body twice, once in Hanbury Street and once again behind a chapel door she could not have entered. He quit the force a week later and was found hanging from a rope of braided hair. The autopsy sketches of Annie's body, now sealed in the Royal Archives, show markings that don't appear in the crime scene photos. Geometric cuts, symbols along the ribs that matched Enochian letters, an angelic language said to summon or bind interdimensional forces. This is where the myth becomes threat, because once symbols appear, we're no longer in the realm of crime. We're in the realm of ritual continuity. Someone wasn't killing Annie for revenge or rage or pleasure. Someone was activating her, using her body as a sigil, as a key. And the question no one dares ask is, what did it open? Because since that night, Whitechapel never slept right again. Time there bends strangely. Bells ring where there are no towers, and some alleys can't be walked twice. Annie didn't die. Annie transferred. There was a reason they stopped talking about Mary Ann Nichols the moment Annie Chapman's body was found. Not because Polly, as she was known in the slums, mattered less, but because she was the template. The dry run. The first draft in a ritual manuscript far older than any coroner's log. Her murder on August 31st was public, brutal, and methodical. But in the days that followed, something strange happened. The butcher's boy who discovered her body claimed her eyes were wide open, but not blind. He said she was watching something just behind him in the dark, something that moved when he moved. Her throat was slashed twice, yes, but not in the way newspapers described. The cuts were measured, not frenzied, as if drawn by a hand that had done it before, on animals, or worse, on willing subjects. And the abdominal wound, a near-perfect crescent, not a rage mark, but an emblem, a half-moon, the symbol of blood rites in several suppressed cult traditions once whispered about in secret societies tied to both the Freemasons and the Order of the Golden Dawn. What few know is that a parchment was found under Polly's skirt, quickly removed and silenced by investigators. Witnesses say it bore a drawing of a two-headed angel standing on a pile of clocks. Time, once again. A constable assigned to the case, Jonathan Cole, was institutionalized after allegedly trying to exhume Polly's body before the next crescent moon. He screamed about alignments and claimed, in lucid moments, that her body wasn't decomposing, but waiting for 4 more. After his removal, that lead was buried. Polly's memory faded. But Whitechapel residents tell a different story, one of nightly whispering in Buck's Row, of shadowed figures tracing symbols on cobblestones with broken fingers. One child drew her image repeatedly, always the same face, the same half-open throat, and always that second set of eyes, wide, ancient, watching. Polly Nichols didn't die that night. She began, on the morning of September 8, 1888, the yard behind 29 Hanbury Street became the stage for a horror deeper than anyone had yet seen. Annie Chapman's body wasn't just mutilated, it was ritualized. Her throat was slit so deeply it nearly severed her head. But that wasn't the disturbing part. It was the removal of her uterus, done with surgical precision in total darkness, without any signs of hesitation. Investigators first whispered it was the work of a doctor, but some said no doctor would have left no blood on the walls, no spatter, no struggle, just a stillness, as if time itself had bent to allow the act. A witness, Mrs. Long, said she heard low chanting from the alley 2 hours prior, a phrase repeated 3 times in a language she couldn't identify. When the body was found, a piece of muslin was folded neatly by Annie's feet, as if it were an offering. And under her head, a comb, not hers, possibly not human. The attending medical examiner later committed suicide, leaving a cryptic note. She was opened by an instrument that did not belong to this century. But what the public never saw were the markings on the inside of her wrists. 2 triangles burned into the skin, both pointing inward, toward the center of her chest. Some say it was the ancient alchemical sign for as above, so below. Others claim it marked her as number 2, the second gate. Residents claimed their clocks stopped the moment she was killed. Church bells rang out, unscheduled, just before dawn. And somewhere in that dead yard, time fractured. Annie Chapman's death was not a killing, it was an invocation. A warning carved in flesh that this wasn't about lust or madness. It was deliberate orchestration, a sequence, a key turning in a lock most of us will never see, but some, those who watched from windows, those who dreamed what came next, they felt it open. The morning after Annie Chapman's dismembered body was carted away, Whitechapel was no longer just afraid, it was watching itself. Eyeballs peered from soot-lined windows. Conversations stopped when footfalls echoed. But deeper than fear was something darker, an unspoken recognition. People began to suspect they weren't dealing with a man. They were facing a process. The police were hopelessly outpaced, chasing shadows, while the killer wrote messages no one could explain. Days after the murder, a note appeared etched in chalk on a wooden fence just a few feet from the crime scene. She opened the gate and did not close it. Scotland Yard dismissed it as a cruel joke, but Inspector Aberline privately had it documented, along with drawings of an identical gate symbol scrawled on the inside of an abandoned butcher's ledger found in a nearby alley, an arcane symbol used by occultists in the 17th century to signify possession by Saturn. Witness reports poured in describing a tall, pale man in a bowler hat who spoke perfect Latin to rats in the gutters, feeding them blackberries. One woman swore he whispered to her baby through the cradle bars, and the child never spoke again. A priest from Spitalfields Church, who'd been offering late-night confessions, left town without a word. His chapel door was found locked from the inside, a blood ring smeared in perfect symmetry around the altar. What terrified Whitechapel wasn't just that someone was killing, it was that someone was unbinding, loosening seams that had held reality in place. At Annie's funeral, fog swallowed the hearse before it left the street. When it emerged, both the driver and the horse were unconscious, and Annie's coffin was warm. The coroner swore he'd signed off on cold flesh. But something shifted in her death. Some said she was only the second note in a 5-part ritual meant to open the way for something old, something that required blood, precision, and an audience, and all of Whitechapel was watching. By the third murder, London had ceased pretending this was the work of a man fueled by madness or lust. It now whispered of a doctrine, a pattern too precise, too patient to be random. Elizabeth Stride was found just before midnight, her throat slit, but her body otherwise untouched, as if interrupted. But the deeper horror was not what was done to her. It was what was left with her. A small, triangular scrap of red velvet placed neatly in her left hand, stitched with a single black thread, shaped like an eye. Police dismissed it as a fluke, but local apothecaries knew better. Red velvet was historically used in binding rituals, where the fabric absorbed intention, and the black eye was a rarely spoken symbol, the watcher's sigil, said to protect a summoner from being seen by the thing they had called. That same morning, across Whitechapel, 3 horses collapsed mid-stride at the exact moment the church bells rang midnight. A gravedigger working in Mile End Cemetery quit after opening a plot and finding a coffin with no bottom. The corpse had sunk, as if swallowed. Meanwhile, in the city records office, an assistant named Horace Flint discovered that every victim so far had one thing in common. They were all born during the solar eclipse of 1843. Flint vanished the next night, his apartment door found jammed shut from the inside, his last scrawled note reading, "I see the Watcher." What began as slaughters had now evolved into ritual placement, with symbols tied to cosmic timing, forgotten gods, and forbidden numbers. And still, the Ripper walked unseen. He wasn't just escaping detection, he was erasing logic, warping the very narrative that investigators tried to cling to. Maps no longer matched. Witness statements conflicted even from the same street. And all the while, the fog grew thicker, not just in the air, but in the mind. Stride's death wasn't a failure. It was a pine, but a signal that something had noticed it was being watched, and that from now on it would watch back. The city awoke to another corpse before it could mourn the last. Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square, her face carved like a puzzle, nose severed, eyelids cut, one kidney removed with surgical accuracy. But more disturbing than the violence was the geography of it. Mitre Square was surrounded on all sides by Masonic structures: St. James's Passage, the Masonic Temple, and the remains of the Knights Templar Commandery. At her feet lay a chalk sigil, not scrawled, but drawn with steady, educated hands. The mark resembled an incomplete compass wrapped around a bleeding heart, a symbol whispered in the deeper halls of secret societies, the ritual of the unbound organ. Whispers began to circulate that the Ripper wasn't one man, but a council, acting under ancient rites to bind death to territory, purify bloodlines, or awaken forgotten forces buried beneath London's catacombs. Scotland Yard tried to suppress this narrative, but a journalist named Alaric Dunst uncovered a sealed record from 1856 detailing a sacrificial twin dissection in the same square, part of an unofficial fraternal cleansing signed by 5 men, all high-ranking Freemasons. Days later, Dunst's body was pulled from the Thames, jaw torn clean off, stuffed with lamb's tongue. Catherine's missing kidney was later mailed to the police with a mocking note in red ink. "I took this for understanding. Did you?" The city now shook with more than fear. It trembled with recognition. The Ripper had power not just of hand, but of access. He could enter guarded zones, erase time logs, manipulate ink in official ledgers. He was a man of station, cloaked in privilege so deep even blood could not stain it. And yet, there was something inhuman about the silence that followed each act. No dogs barked, no clocks chimed. It was as though time itself bent backward in respect. Mitre Square became more than a crime scene. It was an altar, and the people who walked by it felt the air turn colder, as if the stone beneath their feet remembered every incision. As dawn broke over the city's fractured nerves, something even darker than blood began to surface: intention. Catherine Eddowes' autopsy revealed cuts so precise they matched diagrams found in Gray's Anatomy. But this wasn't mere anatomical understanding, it was a message to institutions built on secrecy. The cuts followed lines of initiation known in esoteric rituals: first the removal of the eye to blind earthly vision, then the kidney to represent the corruption of alchemical purity. These weren't murders. They were ceremonies. At Scotland Yard, Inspector Edmund Crowley, a man of devout Catholic faith, was the first to speak aloud what others only whispered. This is not the work of a man. It's the work of a system. Crowley had received an anonymous package the night before. Inside, a single white glove, still damp, and a burnt page from a 15th century Masonic grimoire titled Corpus Mortis. The Latin inscription on the charred edge read, Ex anima surgit ordo. From the soul rises order. Panic bled into policy. Maps were redrawn. News editors were silenced or disappeared entirely. And then came the double blow. Eddowes was murdered only minutes after another woman, Elizabeth Stride, was found dead nearby. 2 kills within an hour, 2 rituals side by side, but one incomplete. Stride's throat was slashed, yet her body was otherwise untouched. Crowley's theory: the Ripper had been interrupted mid-ritual. Someone saw him. Someone still alive. That survivor, if they existed, was now worth more than the Queen's ransom. Secret police patrols began canvassing the East End under the guise of sanitation duty, but in reality they were hunting a ghost, or worse, a witness with knowledge. The streets of Whitechapel changed overnight. Women were no longer prey. They were potential keys to a secret buried deeper than any grave. Somewhere, a ritual was broken. Somewhere, a system cracked. In the weeks that followed the double murders, the East End became a city within a city, one governed not by law, but by superstition, secrecy, and quiet terror. The London Metropolitan Police launched what they called Operation Candlelight, a name not listed in public archives. This operation wasn't designed to catch the Ripper. It was orchestrated to contain the fear and suppress the ritualistic symbols that were beginning to appear all over Whitechapel. On doors, drawn in animal blood or soot, were unfamiliar sigils, concentric triangles, serpents with human faces, the eye pierced by a blade. Churches received anonymous donations wrapped in skin. A child was found in Stepney, clutching a folded note that simply read, "He who speaks will bleed like her." But the most damning evidence arrived by way of a single photograph, recovered from the chimney of a slaughterhouse once used by the Knights Hospitaller during the Black Death. The image was degraded, but clear enough to show a woman's body arranged on a stone slab, surrounded by 4 figures in long black coats with hoods bearing no holes for eyes. In the center, a 5th man, his face turned away, holding a bone-handled scalpel above the body's open abdomen. On the back of the photograph, someone had scrawled in red ink, "Eddowes was the 3rd, you ignored the 1st." The statement shook Crowley to the marrow. There had been another, an earlier victim outside official records, a lost murder that predated the canonical 5. The deeper the inquiry dug, the more rot it unearthed. Not from a man, but from a council of silence buried beneath London's cobbled skin. Orders came from high, stop digging or vanish. Crowley didn't stop, and for that, his house was burned down. No survivors, no bones. Only a single item was ever recovered from the ashes, a silver crucifix warped into the shape of a downward spiral. From this moment forward, Crowley ceased to exist on any registry. The case lost its last honest man. With Crowley vanished, and the official investigation suffocated by forces that would not name themselves, a new face emerged from the fog. Dr. Elias Harrow, a disgraced surgeon from the Royal London Hospital, known only among whispers and medical backchannels for his obsession with post-mortem neural activity. Harrow had been dismissed after it was discovered he'd kept the brains of deceased asylum patients in jars, catalogued not by names, but by their final dream descriptions, scrawled in Latin. He believed death was not immediate, that the soul lingered for minutes, sometimes hours, trying to escape its shell, and that in those moments, the truth of a person could be extracted like venom from a snake. When word reached him of the Ripper's grotesque anatomical precision, clean kidney extractions, precise organ removal in total darkness, Harrow didn't see a madman. He saw a peer. He returned to the East End under a false identity, posing as a mortuary assistant, gaining access to the remnants of Marianne Nichols's body. What he found chilled him. Not just surgical cuts, but engraved notches along the ribs, etched from the inside. A pattern, a message. Harrow's notes described it as a language of bone, older than speech, older than God. But when he tried to publish his findings, he was institutionalized within 48 hours, sent to Netherstone Asylum, a private facility that did not appear on any medical registry. He was never seen again. Years later, a single page from his journal surfaced in a collector's archive. It contained only one phrase, written over and over until the ink tore the page. "The knife remembers, the blade is older than the hand." That page is now locked inside the British Museum's unlisted archive, among other items never made public. Among them, a scalpel made of fossilized bone, and a Victorian-era map with certain Whitechapel streets scratched out and replaced with symbols only Harrow would recognize, symbols that now appear in alleyways after rain, etched into the stone like something trying to climb out from underneath the city itself. In 1893, 5 years after the last official Ripper killing, a sealed crate was discovered buried beneath the stone floor of St. Dunstan's crypt, a church that had been partially destroyed in the Great Fire of London, but curiously rebuilt with stones imported from an abandoned abbey in Carpathia. Inside the crate, preserved surgical instruments, a mummified human hand with 6 fingers, and a blood-stained prayer book written in reverse Latin. What unsettled investigators more, however, was the presence of several small dolls, each hand-carved from human bone, their eyes sewn shut with what appeared to be strands of horsehair soaked in pitch. One doll had a strip of cloth tucked into its mouth. On it, stitched in thread, was a name: C. Harrow. The church quickly suppressed the finding, citing it as a desecration hoax by local children, but one young sexton, Ewan Merrow, leaked sketches of the contents to a fringe London journal. Days later, Merrow vanished. His last recorded act was checking out a single book from the British Library's restricted section, Corpus Sub Rosa, a 15th-century surgical almanac banned across Europe for its illustrations of ritualized vivisection. The connection between the crypt and the Whitechapel killings seemed too grotesque to ignore, unless you were someone who knew what not to say. Secretly, the church hired Dr. Tobias Hume, a forensic ethnographer who specialized in pre-Christian cult practices. His verdict? These are not trophies. They are warnings. Each doll binds the killer to something older than blood. The crate was removed that night under armed guard and never seen again. But whispers of it persist among antique dealers in the East End, tales of an auction held only once every 13 years, in an underground vault beneath Spitalfields, where men bid not with money, but with secrets. The crate, they say, still speaks, tapping when no one's near, humming a prayer no clergyman can translate, and once, during a blackout, it was said to open by itself. What crawled out left no tracks, only scratches across the chapel walls shaped like the Ripper's original incisions, but backwards, as if time had turned in on itself and the crime was about to begin again. By the winter of 1894, a year after the discovery in the crypt, a series of chilling documents surfaced through a disgraced archivist named Benedict Krause, once a royal historian, now exiled to the back rooms of the British Museum's disused storage floors. He had come across a forbidden folio, buried under layers of misfiled 17th-century naval logs. It was marked with a symbol, an inverted crown pierced by a scalpel, and titled simply, The Ash Protocol. Inside were hand-copied pages of correspondence between senior Freemasons, select Vatican operatives, and at least one senior figure of the British monarchy. The subject? A rogue sect known as the Order of Black Lumen, accused of conscripting surgeons, mediums, and anatomists into something that straddled the boundary between necromancy and medicine. The Ripper murders, they claimed, weren't killings. They were replication attempts, dissecting life to map the threshold of death, testing the body for transdimensional resonance. The organs removed were not random. Each had a known alchemical function in the esoteric manuscripts of the order. The uterus, for instance, symbolized the vessel, the gateway, the kidney, purification, the heart, convergence. These were not trophies. They were keys. Krause, desperate and likely sleep-deprived, began to connect ink formulas from the folio to smudges in the police crime scene sketches. The matches were near perfect. He sent these findings to 3 people, a professor at Oxford, a clairvoyant from Edinburgh, and a journalist at the Pall Mall Gazette. Within a month, all 3 died. One fell into the Thames with his throat slit, one accidentally poisoned herself with hemlock, and the last was found in a locked room with no tongue. Krause vanished shortly after. His final letter, never mailed but found beneath his blood-streaked desk blotter, read, "They weren't solving the crime. They were protecting it." The Ripper was not one man. He was the scalpel held by something older. The letter ended mid-sentence. The police sealed the museum's floor, claiming structural instability. But maintenance workers still speak in hushed tones about hearing typewriter clicks at night, though none are plugged in, and seeing a shadowed figure in blood-stained apron and gloves dissecting air in an invisible autopsy, over and over again. In the spring of 1895, nearly 7 years after the final canonical Ripper murder, London's Metropolitan Police received a package that was never logged officially, only whispered about in the hallways of Scotland Yard. It came wrapped in yellowed butcher's paper, tied with human hair, and sealed with candle wax imprinted by a molar. Inside was a single item, a woman's preserved heart, still glistening wet, suspended in a jar of embalming fluid that was labeled Specimen 6. Beneath it, scrawled in a manic script, were the words, "The harvest isn't over, only paused." Attached was a torn page from an anatomy manual on hysterectomies, annotated in blood, and referencing surgeries not practiced since ancient Egypt. This package didn't make headlines. In fact, most of the department never knew it existed. It was intercepted by a covert unit within the Home Office, one never listed on official payroll, but rumored to be formed after the Ripper Panic to deal with unnatural crime scenes and occult forensic patterns. The team, nicknamed the Grey Archive, determined the jar's fluid contained subcellular matter not consistent with embalming agents of the time, something protobiological and biomechanical, like early-stage synthetic tissue. The heart wasn't from 1888. It was fresh, less than 48 hours old. This discovery shook the lead archivist to his bones. Either someone was mimicking the Ripper's ritual perfectly, using knowledge lost to modern science, or something far more disturbing. The same hand was still at work, untouched by time. London hospitals were quietly alerted, morgues double-checked their inventories, and police informants in the medical underworld were paid handsomely for whispers. One such whisper led them to a private mortuary in Shoreditch that had burned down the week prior. In the ashes, investigators found a hidden basement room, untouched by flame, containing 3 glass tables, each with restraints. Surgical tools still gleamed under the soot. And on the wall, drawn in ash and dried blood, the phrase, "To cut is to understand. To understand is to ascend." The room was cold, freezing. But the fire had never touched it, as if the act of knowledge itself had created a shield around the horror. The Grey Archive locked the room, then buried it. But they didn't forget, not because they feared a killer, but because they feared something kept waking him back up, a pattern etched in death, a rhythm of blood, a ritual that time refused to close. The Shoreditch basement was just one chamber in a far larger cathedral of horror that Scotland Yard never admitted existed. After the discovery, the Grey Archive began mapping a series of underground surgical sites, each one found in forgotten tunnels, behind bricked-off walls, or beneath crumbling Victorian houses whose owners disappeared during renovations. The pattern they unearthed, at first denied by senior inspectors, was a near-perfect pentagram spread beneath East London, each point corresponding to a murder site from the Ripper's timeline, and each intersecting corridor hiding something worse than bones. In one, an iron slab engraved with anatomical diagrams of women's reproductive systems, annotated in Latin and something even older, possibly Enochian. In another they found a plaster cast of a woman's torso, but the surface was carved with surgical notations, and the numbers didn't correspond to any known textbooks. The deeper they went, the less human the evidence became. In a tunnel beneath Whitechapel station, they discovered something that shouldn't exist. A preserved Victorian medical bag, the leather soft as if freshly tanned, inside of which were organs sealed in beeswax, tagged in the same hand that signed the infamous "From Hell" letter. The organs were still viable, still soft, as though waiting. The bag was dated 1891, and yet the wax used to preserve them had modern synthetic properties, polymer traces not invented until after World War II. When the forensics team tried to test them, the samples vaporized under light. Every inch of this trail screamed ritual preservation, not just for study, but for resurrection, as if someone, or something, wanted to reverse engineer death itself. This wasn't about killing. It was about building a knowledge machine out of murder, using fear and flesh as input. One path led to a chamber filled with what looked like human marionettes, stitched-together bodies held upright by surgical rods. Some posed in the exact positions victims were found in 1888. Each puppet had a mirror placed before it, all cracked, all reflecting nothing, as if even light refused to acknowledge what stood there. The Gray Archive classified it as ritual theater, type black, and at the center of the room, a hand-drawn anatomical chart signed with a single letter, J, written in blood, old and fresh, layered together. The implication was chilling. Jack never left. He nested. It was in December 1891, 3 years after the last canonical Ripper murder, that an unsigned report was leaked to the Gray Archive, a crumbling medical document retrieved from the archives of the Royal London Hospital. It detailed the admission of a mute woman, wrapped in blood-stained linens, with internal injuries that mirrored the exact surgical patterns of Mary Jane Kelly. But this woman was not dead. She had survived a disembowelment that, by all modern reasoning, should have killed her. The physicians, horrified but enthralled, documented her case with religious devotion, calling her Patient Omega. Over the course of her 3-week stay, she spoke not a word, but every night, nurses reported the same ritual. She would trace invisible symbols on the walls, her fingers moving rhythmically in midair. On the 22nd night, one nurse went missing. On the 23rd, they found the missing nurse folded neatly beneath the hospital chapel's altar, with her vocal cords removed and placed on the chapel Bible like a bookmark. Omega was gone. The hospital declared it a suicide and burned the records. But the report leaked by a mortuary assistant told another story. It claimed the woman had carved open her own abdomen in front of a mirror, not to die, but to show something hidden inside. Inside her were objects, a brass key, a clockwork gear, and a tiny scroll wrapped in a strand of hair. The scroll bore one phrase, scrawled in a dead dialect of Aramaic. "He who was unmade shall rise when the pattern is complete." This incident sent the Gray Archive into lockdown. They began scanning all missing persons cases from 1885 to 1891 for similar silent survivors, and found 6, each one female, each bearing the same abdominal signature, and each having been released or discharged before being found dead or vanished. These weren't just victims, they were vessels, and whatever had been placed inside them was no longer human. The implication was terrifying. The Ripper wasn't executing women. He was installing something inside them, like a craftsman embedding a gear into a larger machine. A machine made of living parts, a ritual in pieces, and Patient Omega was the final lock. By the winter of 1892, a classified investigation, internally referred to as Project Morpheus, was quietly opened under the Home Office, entirely off record. It wasn't led by Scotland Yard, but by Dr. Thelonious Garrett, a man whose name appeared nowhere in official medical directories, yet whose presence haunts the margins of multiple occult investigations across Europe. Garrett was not searching for a man. He was tracing a pattern of resurrections. His theory, the Ripper murders were part of a long-dormant ritual known as the unbinding, meant to splinter time, invert human anatomy, and allow a forgotten intelligence to wear flesh again. Garrett's files spoke of the recursion of blood, a phenomenon where trauma repeated with precise anatomical echoes causes a rupture in chronology. He believed each Ripper victim was killed not at random, but on specific ley line intersections, where spiritual architecture intersected underground plague tunnels and ancient monastic burial shafts. His notes, feverishly inked in Latin, Hebrew, and mathematical symbols, proposed that Whitechapel was chosen not for its poverty, but because beneath it lies a geometric wound, a fracture in the very logic of reality. Witnesses he interviewed described waking at 3:33 a.m. with bleeding eyes and seeing women walking backward through the fog, faces turned inside out, mouths open, not in screams, but in silence, as if their lungs had been emptied of time. He tracked down the family of Catherine Eddowes and found a wooden box hidden under floorboards containing her preserved uterus wrapped in parchment. The parchment bore symbols matching Babylonian birthrights and an insignia shaped like an hourglass made of teeth. Garrett's conclusion chilled even the archivists of the Gray Archive. The Ripper wasn't one man. It was a looping act, a ritual performed through centuries with different hands but one will. And the final victim would not be the end, but the beginning of something older than language. Garrett vanished shortly after submitting this theory, his rooms found in disarray, walls smeared with numbers, and his tongue nailed to the underside of his desk. The last line in his notebook: "I have found the final coordinate. It bleeds time. The night of October 13th, 1893, an unnamed archivist at the Royal College of Surgeons smuggled a locked case labeled R17 Aleph into the sub-basement of the institution, never to be seen again." The file, later discovered in fragments, described an encounter with what was called the Silent Woman. She appeared outside Mitre Square, dressed in heavy mourning garments soaked with river water, whispering to no one. Witnesses swore she left no footprints, though the night had rained relentlessly. She was said to carry a surgical bag, identical to those used by doctors at Bethlehem Asylum during brain separation procedures. When police approached, she looked up, not in fear, but in recognition. Her eyes, pale and clouded, matched perfectly the preserved irises of Mary Jane Kelly, who had been buried 3 years prior. That same week, 6 different pathologists across London went mad, each carving non-Euclidean diagrams into the walls of their homes before being institutionalized. Inside one of their homes, investigators found a cradle filled with sawdust, and a note pinned above it reading, "The child born of red fog cannot die, only return." Reports escalated, butchers vanished, grave robbers found entire cemeteries emptied, and the gaslight flicker in East End streets began synchronizing into Morse rhythms, spelling out one repeating phrase: "Do not exhume the time-locked heart." Spiritualists, desperate for answers, conducted automatic writing seances only to draw the same image: a woman with 2 mouths, one sewn shut, the other wide and grinning with inverted teeth. She was named in whispers, the Bride of the Knife. An underground sect began to believe the Ripper's victims were not the end product, but vessels waiting for reawakening. In their hidden catacombs beneath London, robed figures recreated the Ripper's cuts on wax mannequins filled with black lilies, believing it would awaken her. The Silent Woman, they claimed, would be the mother of the second incision of history. They prepared the final room, an embalming table carved from yew, a basin filled with mercury, and 12 scalpels inscribed with the word Iliathy, a name never found in any mortal text, but whispered by corpses in their final breath. By the turn of 1894, Whitechapel had become less a district and more a living wound, a haunted body of cobbled arteries and gasping alleys. The newspapers had gone quiet, but not from lack of material, from orders. Scotland Yard received a memorandum marked with a seal they refused to acknowledge publicly, a hand with 7 fingers grasping a serpent. Behind closed doors, this symbol became associated with the Eidolon Division, a covert arm of the British state tasked with preserving societal sanity at the expense of truth. It was this unit that intercepted a private letter mailed from Lviv, Poland, addressed to the remaining surgeon of Hanbury Street. The letter contained only a small piece of human tongue, wrapped in linen, and the phrase, "The red voice grows louder. She remembers the 5th who was not killed." What followed was a quiet investigation into a woman named Eliza White, a nurse discharged from St. Bartholomew's in 1886 for inappropriate anatomical drawings. She had since vanished, but a record surfaced indicating she'd filed a patent for a machine titled Perceptual Reversal Box, a device that, when stared into, was said to allow the viewer to see what the victim saw seconds before death in reverse. The machine was tested on an unnamed constable. He survived only 7 minutes after viewing it, during which he repeatedly whispered, "The hands. The hands aren't his." The machine was locked away, but not before one final image was recovered from its mirror. A shadow with no head but 2 spines, looming over a blood-stained bed frame. That frame was later identified as belonging to Annie Chapman, whose body had been exhumed and found to be empty of organs, though her coffin had never been disturbed. Rumors circled among the city's embalmers and morticians that an underground medical guild had taken her, believing the Ripper's work incomplete. Their goal, and to build the 13th body, a corpse composed of 1 piece from each victim, stitched together into a vessel for resurrection. And at the center of their diagram, scrawled in blood beneath the autopsy table, was a phrase scratched hundreds of times. The knife never left his hand. He left it in all of us. The silence surrounding the Eidolon Division's findings only grew louder after the winter of 1895, when the entire morgue ledger of Whitechapel Hospital mysteriously vanished from its iron cabinet, right after being requisitioned by Inspector Edmund Wells, a man known for never appearing in photographs despite numerous public events. No trace of Wells was found after that night, except for his wristwatch, discovered inside the stomach of a dead crow perched atop the mortuary's sign. What happened next split the narrative into 2 timelines, one presented to the public, a dull, forgettable parade of dead ends, and the other whispered only among the dying. According to a retired gravedigger named Morris Heggs, who later went blind from an unknown eye infection, the bodies of Ripper victims began appearing in duplicate. That is, new corpses, women, bearing the same wounds, in the same order, turning up in alleyways far from London, Prague, Boston, even Calcutta. These weren't mere copycat crimes. The bodies were genetically identical to the originals, teeth matched, scars matched. Even the locket found on Catherine Eddowes was recovered 3 times in 3 different countries. The implication was unthinkable. Someone, or something, was repeating the murders across the globe, exactly, flawlessly, as if trapped in a ritual with no end. In a secret report hidden within the Archbishop's private archives at Lambeth Palace, a letter was found addressed to Her Majesty's astral cartographer, stating, "We have mapped the locations. They form a glyph. Each is a point on the hand of a clock. When it completes the hour, it opens again." What it was, no one dared say aloud, but maps drawn from these murder locations revealed a spiral that seemed to tighten over time, each kill inching closer to its unknown center. That center, marked with a red thumbprint, was not a location on Earth, but rather a symbol from ancient Mesopotamia, translated as the House of Echoes. A forbidden structure once believed to exist only in myth, built not to shelter the living, but to contain a voice that could undo the soul. From that moment forward, all official Ripper investigations were not closed, but classified, as if waiting for a moment in time not yet arrived. A final event. A last breath. A return. It was in March of 1896 that the final known witness to the Ripper's truth, a railway switchman named Callum Dreve, confessed something so impossible it was buried beneath 3 layers of church injunction before it could reach public knowledge. Dreve claimed that beneath the East Ham rail junction, during a late-night track inspection, he heard what he thought was a woman crying in the tunnel. When he followed the sound, what he found instead was a stone stairwell concealed behind a false wall of soot-stained brick. It spiraled downward, far beneath the water table, ending in a circular room with no doors, only 12 mirrors standing upright around a surgical slab made of ash wood and bone dust. The moment Dreve stepped across the threshold, every mirror flickered to life, not with his own reflection, but with 12 versions of Mary Jane Kelly, each one mutilated differently, each screaming silently as if caught in a loop. Above the slab, a single lantern hung, swinging despite the air being still. The entire chamber smelled of salt and rust, and the switchman's lantern began to flicker violently, as if rejecting what it was showing him. Dreve fled, but not before noticing that every mirror bore a number etched into the glass with a scalpel. Each was labeled with a year, and the last mirror said 2033. He later told a constable that the room was not built by man. It was grown, like a tumor in the earth. After his report, Dreve vanished from all records, and the next 3 switchmen assigned to East Ham were institutionalized within a month, each babbling about women behind glass, screaming backwards. A Vatican response unit was quietly dispatched to the site, and though the stairwell was reportedly sealed forever, a telegram sent to the Archbishop of Canterbury 2 nights later simply read, "Mirror 11 is empty, the slab is wet." This marked the last recorded attempt to interfere with the Ripper's residual domain. From that moment forward, whispers of the echo cycle grew louder. It was no longer considered the work of a man, but of a mechanism, a cosmological autopsy being repeated through human time until someone got it right. The killer was never caught, because he was never supposed to be. He was a repeating sentence, and London was only the first syllable. By the early 20th century, an unofficial coalition of scholars, occultists, and former Scotland Yard detectives began compiling what they called the Ripper Codex, not a file of suspects, but a chronicle of locations, artifacts, and psychic impressions left behind at each murder site. They noticed something chilling. At every known Ripper scene, within a 10-meter radius, timekeeping devices failed. Pocket watches stopped. Gaslights dimmed inexplicably. In one case, a mounted police officer reported hearing a woman screaming before he entered the alley, and found the body still warm. The Codex theorized that the Ripper wasn't just a murderer, but a time-anchored event, like lightning that struck through centuries in the same pattern to the same effect, using different faces. Several contributors, including Dr. Lyle Henshaw, a once-respected criminologist who later burned down his own university office, believed the Ripper was a ritual echo, one designed to distort causality itself. Henshaw claimed the killings aligned perfectly with an ancient Babylonian sequence used to trap deities in flesh, an inverted binding ritual where each victim was a living sigil. Their deaths weren't symbolic, they were structural, like beams in a hidden architecture. When police tried to recreate the scenes photographically for training, the photos would develop incorrectly, showing double exposures of mutilated corpses where none had been placed, or faces of bystanders blurred beyond recognition as if rejected by time itself. In one especially disturbing case, a dry plate photograph of Mitre Square revealed a 13th figure dressed in 17th century plague doctor garb, standing over the victim's remains. But he had not been present, nor had any such outfit been found. Attempts to track the origins of the film stock led to a defunct factory in Kent that had burned down on the day the picture was taken. The Ripper Codex was eventually classified by the Crown as unfit for public morality, and all known copies were seized. But fragments still exist. In one torn journal entry, written by a man who signed only A.J., a final note was scrawled beside an ink sketch of a 7-eyed woman. The Ripper is not who, the Ripper is when, and when is not done. There is a hidden hallway beneath what was once the Royal London Hospital, sealed behind a false wall and forgotten for nearly a century. In 1938, workers repairing a steam line accidentally breached the stone, revealing a narrow passage scrawled with charcoal markings in multiple languages: Greek, Hebrew, Latin, and something unrecognizable. Inside were 7 skeletal remains, each posed in a fetal position, their skulls bored with identical deliberate punctures in the frontal bone. What set the discovery apart wasn't the state of the bodies, but what was buried in their mouths: surgical scalpels, all engraved with the same symbol found on letters attributed to Jack the Ripper. A reverse triangle pierced by a serpent. The tools were impossibly modern, not Victorian in design, crafted with precision milling technology decades ahead of their time. The hospital shut down the corridor immediately, and the government invoked the Official Secrets Act. But two morgue attendants who snuck back in to photograph the site later claimed to have seen one of the skeletons move, not in animation, but as if the hallway had reset, like they had entered at the wrong moment. One reported waking up days later in a train station in Edinburgh, unable to remember how he got there, holding a coin from 1891 in his fist. That same year, an anonymous letter was sent to the Times, warning that the Ripper's tools were never human, nor meant to be. They whisper. They choose. The hallway was resealed with reinforced concrete in 1941 under the cover of air raid repairs. Since then, the surrounding building has reported repeating smells of iron and ammonia, sudden temperature drops, and clocks malfunctioning when brought near the wall. A recent infrared scan by an urban explorer revealed something even more chilling. Heat signatures. 7 of them. Still there. Still warm. The site, now under armed surveillance, is marked on no modern map. But if you know where to place your hand on the eastern wall, they say you can still feel it breathing. A slow, rhythmic pulse that matches no heartbeat known to man. Whatever was buried with those scalpels was never meant to die. And it didn't. In 1904, a weathered trunk was pulled from the River Thames near Wapping. It was sealed shut with tar and iron bands and bore an inscription, "Property of the Ash Ministry, not to be opened." Against orders, the local constable pried it open. Inside were 3 objects: a child's porcelain doll, a set of Ripper-style surgical knives, and a small leather-bound notebook titled Schedule of the Veil, Sessions 1 through 12. The doll's face had been repainted, delicately, but unnervingly wrong, with pupils replaced by spirals and its mouth sewn shut with human hair. The knives were pristine, but the notebook was worse. It listed names, real names, of people who would go missing in London in the following 5 years, dates accurate to the day. On the last page was a single line: Session 13, not born yet. The constable who opened the box went mad 2 days later, carving spirals into the walls of his cell until he bled out through his fingertips. Scotland Yard archived the box in a restricted vault, labeling it Prophetic Material, Do Not Investigate. That vault was destroyed in the Blitz, but not by bombs. Witnesses claim something was seen crawling from the fire, something carrying the doll, now blinking. It vanished into the alleys. Over the decades, rumors about the Ash Ministry have surfaced in coded memoirs and vanished newspaper clippings, always tied to Ripper sightings, time anomalies, and child disappearances. The doll has become a kind of cursed relic, photographed in 3 separate murder scenes, always in the background, always in the same position, as if waiting. The knives, though believed lost, appeared in an underground auction in 1981. The winning bidder, never identified, died the next day in a locked room with his own eyes missing. The notebook was last photographed in the possession of a Jesuit archivist who later burned himself alive in Prague, claiming, "The 13th session has begun. We let it speak." And somewhere in Whitechapel, they say a small girl walks the fog alone, dragging something behind her, a doll with no eyes, a scalpel in its lap, and a whispering mouth that shouldn't open. In 1937, a sealed crypt beneath St. Martin in the Fields was opened during routine renovations. It had no official records, no registry of interment, and no architectural reason to exist, yet there it was, carved with mathematical precision into the bedrock. Inside were 13 coffins arranged in a spiral. 11 were child-sized, 1 was adult, and 1, placed at the spiral's exact center, was not a coffin at all, but a black mirrored box, reflecting nothing. Each child's coffin contained the same thing, a wax figure wearing Victorian clothes, with hands carved from real bone and eyes missing. The adult coffin contained no body, only a blood-soaked bishop's robe and a mask, the kind worn in medieval plague rituals, etched with alchemical symbols. The mirrored box, when touched, vibrated with a faint hum, as if alive. The priest overseeing the renovation reportedly said, "We have opened what was meant to be kept below prophecy." Hours later, he was found hanging from the bell tower, with his tongue replaced by wax and his fingertips filed into points. Scotland Yard took possession of the artifacts, but no official report was ever filed. Whispers say the box was moved to a Cold War bunker near Cornwall, tested by MI5 scientists under something called the Ashford Protocol. The project was terminated after 5 researchers gouged out their own eyes, each leaving behind the same message: "The veil blinks." The box was never destroyed. To this day, those who claim to have seen it describe it the same way. It shows you not the future, but the moment you are erased from memory. The wax figures, however, began appearing elsewhere, in school basements, behind false walls in orphanages, even buried inside the foundations of public libraries, each time a child went missing in the neighborhood that same week. The adult mask resurfaced briefly in 1965, worn by a figure in a grainy film, reel from a London protest. That footage was confiscated. But in a single frame that escaped censors, the masked figure stands in the crowd, motionless, everyone around him blurred in motion except one child holding his hand, eyes completely white, mouth agape as if mid-scream. Yet no sound was heard. In late autumn of 1939, as war drums echoed across Europe, a peculiar dispatch was sent from the Whitechapel coroner's office to the Home Office, marked "Classified," for eyes who no longer sleep. It referenced a re-examination of 5 Ripper victims exhumed under secret order. All 5 bodies, after over 50 years underground, were inexplicably preserved, skin pliable, eyes open, blood congealed but not dry. Autopsies revealed something far worse: surgical precision not achievable by 19th century instruments. Tiny incisions, barely visible to the human eye, marked the internal organs. One liver was etched with coordinates. Another uterus bore engraved numbers, which when decoded formed dates all pointing toward global tragedies. Titanic's sinking, Archduke Ferdinand's death, the Reichstag fire. It was as if the murders weren't killings, but inscriptions, flesh as parchment. Deeper beneath the bodies, in the soil of Whitechapel itself, a strange metal box was discovered, blackened with age, humming faintly. Inside, a roll of undeveloped film and a crude lens carved from volcanic glass. When the film was exposed using the lens, it revealed moving images of gas-lit London streets. Only the camera angle floated above the rooftops, like it was watching from the air. In the footage, Jack the Ripper isn't a man, but a shadow, flowing between alleyways like ink in water, arms too long, head misshapen. It follows victims silently, and just before each strike, its form becomes perfectly human, adopting the shape of someone the victim knew: a lover, a friend, a constable. One reel shows it walking past a reflective window, and no reflection returns. The analyst who viewed the full reel was institutionalized, repeating only one phrase until he died: "It knew my face before I was born." The rest of the film was locked away, the coroner silenced, and Whitechapel's graveyard grounds salté, dye, and concreted over. Yet in 1973, during subway tunnel expansions beneath the site, workers found teeth embedded in the stone walls, not human, not animal. And in the wet cement of a maintenance shaft wall, a child drew a stick figure with long arms and a phrase in backward lettering: "He writes in women." That shaft has since been sealed. In the wake of the coroner's forbidden findings, a chilling memo surfaced, buried deep within the archives of Her Majesty's Special Inquiry Division, dated February 5, 1940. It warned of a phenomenon spreading from the Whitechapel grave site, the so-called ink flesh effect. In areas surrounding the exhumation, Several residents reported waking to find pages of old newspapers fused to their skin, ink embedded in muscle tissue, forming backwards headlines in a language no scholar could translate. One woman, a laundress on Durward Street, was found naked and catatonic, with her chest scarred in looping calligraphy that read, "I listened too long at the door." The walls of her tenement were scraped bare, every letter from books, signs, even Bibles, gone, as if language itself had been consumed. Scholars consulted from Oxford and the Vatican offered no explanation, only warnings. Language is a living entity. When murdered, it does not die. It becomes something else. Several witnesses reported that words on gravestones near the exhumed bodies began to crawl, letter by letter shifting positions, forming new names, dates in the future, phrases like "next is yours" and "bleed the reader." The Royal Engineers, dispatched under cover of darkness, cemented over every marked tomb and removed all signage in the surrounding quarter, yet the contamination had already leached into the soil, air, and psyche. One inspector, weeks after the operation, was found in his home in Kent. His body wrapped in pages torn from his own journals, sewn into his skin with fishing wire, and a phrase pinned to his tongue, "He who reads too deep bleeds." That incident was the last straw. A royal decree was issued to declare all Ripper-related research a matter of national silence. Operation Cloak. Files were redacted, photographs burned, and those too close to the findings were reassigned, institutionalized, or vanished. But fragments of this linguistic rot still emerge. In 1991, a London graffiti artist died mid-spray, his final tag spelling out, "He writes in women again," in a dialect not spoken since Babylon fell. The wall was torn down, but under each fresh layer of paint, the phrase returns. The cover-up may have succeeded in paper, but it failed in flesh. By the late 1950s, whispers of what became known as Ripper's Drift spread through psychiatric hospitals across England. Patients who had no connection to Whitechapel, no access to news or books, began drawing identical floor plans of the crime scenes. One man, in a locked ward in Liverpool, scrawled the same crescent-shaped alley 5 nights in a row, muttering, "He watched from the chimney as nurses sedated him." A woman in Colney Hatch, institutionalized since childhood, screamed when handed a pencil, insisting the man with no thumb would crawl through her skull if she wrote his name. More disturbing were the coincidental throat injuries suffered by several of these patients, bruises and slashes appearing during sleep, matching the precise arc of Catherine Eddowes' post-mortem wound. In 1961, an ambitious forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Edwin Sykes attempted a regression hypnosis experiment on 5 unrelated patients afflicted with mimetic delusions. By the 3rd session, all 5 uttered the same chilling sentence in perfect unison, "I am him, and he is not dead." Sykes pressed further, demanding a name. The response was a low, guttural laugh, followed by each patient projectile vomiting ink-black fluid, which burned through the examination table like acid. The facility was quarantined. Sykes went missing 2 weeks later. His office walls were found covered in hand-drawn maps of London's sewer tunnels, lines drawn in blood, connecting each original Ripper site to a single unmarked location beneath Tower Bridge. Authorities deemed it psychotic ravings, but within a year, 2 more doctors researching the incident were found dead, one hanged by typewriter ribbon, the other drowned in his own bathtub filled with soot and newspaper ink. These weren't isolated mental breaks. This was a feedback loop of hysteria. I call horror reawakening in those who ventured too close. In 1974, MI5 classified the case as a Category 7 temporal echo event, typically reserved for phenomena involving residual psychic trauma fused to a location or entity. The Jack the Ripper killings had by then become more than murders. They had become a living archetype, a parasitic form of memory that could possess, reenact, and consume those who looked too deep. It no longer mattered who he was. What mattered was that he still is. The final piece of this grotesque puzzle emerged from an unlikely place: the crumbling archives of a decommissioned Anglican church turned storage facility in Essex. In 1983, a volunteer named Harold Finch, cataloging mold-eaten texts, stumbled upon a sealed copper lockbox marked with a rook seal, an insignia traced back to the Archbishop's personal Inquisition ledger during the Victorian era. Inside was a bound ledger titled, "Extracted from the Mouth of the Confessor." It detailed a confession made not by the killer, but by a man who claimed to have created him. The writer, Father Aldwin Mercer, recounted an unholy rite performed beneath the catacombs of Whitechapel in August 1887, a full year before the first known Ripper killing. Mercer described a ritual to summon a purifier, a vessel of divine and infernal correction, engineered to cleanse England's impure classes through surgical fear. He claimed the man chosen was an orphaned military medic with no birth records, indoctrinated through pain, isolation, and ancient texts removed from the Vatican's forbidden section. The rite involved blood drawn from 7 madwomen, ashes from burnt Freemason parchments, and a scalpel soaked in lamb's heart and belladonna. What they created was not a man. Mercer wrote, "It spoke in 5 voices, none its own. It obeyed only when unseen. It wept before killing, as if aware of its borrowed fate." Most horrifying was Mercer's admission that the church funded the early Whitechapel refuge clinics, where the Ripper's victims voluntarily came for help, their names logged, their ailments recorded, their disappearance later blamed on poverty's chaos. The ledger ends with Mercer's final note: "I heard it last night in my walls. It is neither past nor dead. It is consequence given form. Forgive me." Finch, who discovered the box, went blind within weeks, his retinas described as burned from the inside. He died babbling about the 5th voice, the one that was mine. The lockbox vanished from records the following year. The story, buried beneath bureaucratic shame, reveals the most horrifying truth of all. Jack the Ripper may have been manufactured, an engineered moral weapon, incubated by empire, released by ritual, and fed by silence. The killer wasn't just born in Fog Alley. He was forged in the hollow heart of civilization, wielded as a scalpel against its own infected soul. What haunts most isn't that the Ripper escaped justice. It's that he may have fulfilled a purpose still echoing today. In 2023, a sealed MI6 report was leaked anonymously onto a deep web archive known only as the Hollow Ledger. The file, buried under 1,000 fake redirect pages, was labeled Op White Trace. It detailed post-war British intelligence efforts to locate and replicate Operation Mercy Blade, a code name tied directly to the Ripper legend. The program was shut down in 1968 after 5 young women vanished from a psychiatric hospital in Kent. Each victim found later with surgical incisions matching 1888 wounds, flawless, precise, post-mortem. The internal memo stated, Subject 5 regained consciousness during Procedure 6. She spoke Latin despite no formal education. Autopsy recorded 2 hearts, 1 vestigial. The implication? That something from the Ripper program survived, passed on, reborn, or possibly reassembled. The file noted a figure only referred to as the harrowed surgeon, seen multiple times in various conflict zones, from Belfast to Basra, always where cleansing operations left civilian corpses eerily untouched externally, but surgically harvested internally. The surgeon left no footprints, no records, only patterns. And it wasn't just Britain. CIA documents cross-referenced a similar figure codenamed Whisper, found in a 1954 MK Ultra file where a test subject scrawled on the wall, "He slices history into silence." Both agencies abandoned further inquiry, not due to failure, but fear. as if acknowledging the pattern gave it power. This theory reframes everything. The Ripper wasn't a lone madman, but a blueprint for modern moral warfare, carried out through institutions, rituals, and the illusion of randomness. He wasn't a man at all. He was a formula. Fear plus control plus narrative equals silence. And silence, refined over centuries, is the sharpest blicky a regime can wield. The fog of Whitechapel was not the end, but the beginning. What began in blood and whispers still lingers, bleeding through our headlines, our hospitals, our wars, and our fears. The Ripper is no longer a who. He is a what, an algorithm of dread. He's in the systems we never question, the disappearances we never connect, and the names we're told not to remember. In 1972, a confidential symposium was held at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, attended not by doctors but by military liaisons, occult historians, and psychological warfare strategists. The subject of the gathering was listed simply as the Whitechapel Pattern, Application in Psychological Subjugation. Declassified audio transcripts recovered in 2011 reveal one phrase repeated by every speaker, regardless of origin or field. The Ripper was the first successful mimetic weapon. Not merely a killer, but an idea engineered to replicate itself across generations, through fear, symbol, and suggestion. This weapon was said to bypass resistance by embedding itself into the collective unconscious, much like a virus hiding inside cultural myth. A surgeon's shadow in an alley. The echo of a footstep behind you. The detail is never clear, because the ambiguity is the weapon. They called it the algorithm of dread, implanting images and ideas so potent they rot the mind's logic from the inside. This is why the Ripper's letters matter more than the murders, why the press was fed contradictions, why the case was never solved, not because they couldn't, but because solving it would kill the myth. And the myth is far more valuable than a corpse. One declassified diagram displayed at the symposium was a neural mapping of fear response in orphan children shown fictional recreations of the Ripper attacks. Most experienced temporary blindness. One spoke in fluent Greek, despite being born in Manchester. The consensus? The Ripper's myth triggers something older than language, deeper than trauma. A primordial defense mechanism. The mind shuts down or breaks open. This isn't history. It's maintenance of a control structure built on archetype, death, and silence. A former MI5 handler at the event reportedly left the meeting muttering, "The more you name him, the closer he gets." He's in the language now. Perhaps the most terrifying idea isn't that the Ripper was a person, but that he was a prototype, tested in the slums of 1888 to prepare the world for psychological control beyond bullets and borders. He was the first scalpel in a surgery that never ended. And now we arrive at the truth buried deeper than any shallow grave in Whitechapel. It was never about who Jack the Ripper was. That was the riddle offered to distract, to mesmerize, to keep the masses guessing while the real work occurred in the silence behind their eyes. The Ripper was not a man, not even a collection of men. He was an operational archetype, engineered to induce a social hypnosis, a trans-historical trance where logic withers and fear becomes governance. Look at how the legend functions, uncaught, undefined, eternal. That's not coincidence, it's design. From the streets of London to the minds of millions, the Ripper story was seeded to echo forever. Not in headlines, but in behaviors. Women looking over shoulders, cities fearing nightfall. Entire disciplines of forensic psychology born from a myth that refused to die. Even now, modern serial killers adopt the aesthetic. Letters, mutilations, cryptic symbols. Because the Ripper's blueprint works. He taught the institution something crucial. Fear isn't most effective when it's loud and gory. It's most effective when it's unsolved, when it bleeds just enough to awaken the monster in everyone's memory. In 2022, a child in Tokyo reportedly drew the exact layout of Miller's court without ever hearing the name Mary Jane Kelly. In 1999, an AI trained on unsolved murders produced a name it refused to explain, Leather Apron. And in 2025, today, you are still watching, still reading, still wondering. Because the Ripper was never just 5 bodies. He was the seed of a new kind of control, one that feeds on mystery, on doubt, on darkness, one that grows stronger every time a man whispers, "Who was Jack the Ripper?" The answer is simple. He still is.